Thank you, Markus. Thank you, Nariman, for giving us the possibility to give this talk. And let me first give you a brief overview of the content that we will present today. We will start with an introduction of the interwar period of so-called Red Vienna and its approach to architecture, followed by some comments on the life and work of the architect of the complex, Franz Schuster. Then we will give some notes on the situation of post-war Vienna that actually led into the construction of the Siemensstraße complex. And then we'll talk, of course, about the housing complex itself, its architectural concept, the structure of the complex, and the duplex system. And we will end with some quick notes on the exhibition Terra Nova, which actually takes place within the Siedlung Siemensstraße, and some reports on of contemporary witnesses who grew up in the Siemensstraße and partially still live there. Let me start with the interwar period. The Siemensstraße complex in Vienna's 21st district was the result of the so-called rapid building program that was initiated because of a severe housing shortage after the Second World War. But to really understand the project of architect Franz Schuster, on the screen you can see marked red the area of the 21st district in Vienna, so it's north in the northern part of the city. So Franz Schuster, to understand Franz Schuster's project, we have to go, as I said, back in time into the era of Red Vienna that was between 1919 and 1934. And while other European cities and states managed to elect social democratic leadership only for short periods after the First World War, the Social Democratic Workers' Party in Austria held constant control over the city after gaining an absolute majority at the municipal election of May 1919. This is remarkable because this control not only lasted for 15 years, but it was also achieved by democratic elections and not by any form of revolution or coup d'etat. And that's very unlike other socialistic governments, often projects of the time. Because of this, Red Vienna was able to start a leftist project aiming towards the creation of a so-called new socialistic human, and therefore sustainably change the city's culture, the welfare system, economy, and of course urban space itself. One of the most significant results of Red Vienna is the city government's municipal housing program. That was, on one side, the reaction to the miserable housing situation of the working class since the 19th century Industrial Revolution, and severe housing shortage after the war, and the following collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. Vienna, the imperial capital, a metropolis with more than 2 million inhabitants, all of a sudden became a capital of a very small republic with just around 6.5 million citizens. Hyperinflation, the shortage of supply goods made the situation even worse. So the city government's building offensive was designed as an answer to these problems, and at the same time it aimed towards a better future, resulting in two directions of impact. We see here the first part of building activities of the time that were settlements on the periphery with terraced houses, which implemented ideas of cooperative ownership, shared infrastructure, self-administration, and provided the possibility of growing fruit, vegetables, as well as raising small livestock. On the other side, communal managed residential blocks, often huge blocks or like super blocks, were constituted inside the city. We can see an example here, the Rabenhof in the 3rd district of Vienna. That included large number, and here the Karl-Marx-Hof, maybe the most well-known building of that time, and one of the biggest. These complexes included a large number of community buildings, such as laundry facilities, kindergartens, schools, public baths, sports facilities, health clinics, libraries, and artist studios. In this way, the needs of practical housing were brought in line with the demands of a new social democratic society by providing a modern and functional living space that adopted, of course, proven architectural concepts such as the terrace, the courtyard, or the arcade. Well-ventilated and well-lit rooms, running water in all units, as well as club and meeting rooms to promote social activities, should lead to what Siegfried Gideon had called a humanization of the city. All of this resulted in the realization of around 65,000 housing units throughout the era of Red Vienna, and many of them still shape the city's space and character. And one of the architects who started his career in this era was Franz Schuster, and Georg will tell you now more about him.
Yeah, so it's my turn now. So welcome from my side. We are glad to have the opportunity to give some information about this estate and about the exhibition we realized. We started to plan the exhibition some 2 years ago. I will come back later on that adventure. In addition to what Wolfgang just said, I now would like to focus on the architectural characteristics and specifics of the Siemensstraße housing estate. To fully understand and to appreciate the qualities of the Siemensstraße, we at first have to know a bit more about the architect, about his life and his education, about his architectural intentions, his ideas, and at least roughly the context of his thinking. So to start with, the architect who planned, hold on, I'll give you the next one. Yeah, that's Franz Schuster. To start with, as Wolfgang already mentioned, Franz Schuster, this certain Austrian architect, and I guess you've never heard of him, and that's not surprising at all. Although Schuster was a highly gifted and, in our opinion, a quite innovative architect, he was and still is rarely mentioned in the dictionaries and in the relevant handbooks. For instance, when we look into the still canonical Penguin Dictionary of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, or when we look into Siegfried Gideon's Time, Space, Time and Architecture, Schuster isn't mentioned with a single word. The reason for this lay in Schuster's changing and a bit unsteady ideological views. In the 1920s, as a young man, he was a radical left-wing thinker with strong sympathies for Marxism. This can be proved by reading his early writings. In an article from 1926, Schuster proposed to destroy large parts of the old city of Vienna and then to rebuild the town with new architectural forms based on new aesthetic principles. His goal was to erect a new city for the masses, as he put it, for the so-called new human or new man, that is, for the proletarian, who, in Schuster's view, had other preferences than the bourgeoisie. And he wrote, "The new goal of city planning, of a new culture of living, of a new technical and economic conception of building are so important then that in order to prepare the necessary changes, the urban planner, the architect, and the construction manager need support from all sides. This quotation is quite telling and very characteristic for Schuster's idea of what architecture is all about. It was his lifelong conviction that architects have the duty not only to build houses or hotels or bridges or churches or what else, but to enhance the culture of living as a result of a tight cooperation between the urban planner, the architect, and the construction manager. This concept of mutual help, of cooperation, of giving support to each other was Schuster's guiding idea throughout his whole life. We will come back to this point later, because this very idea of cooperation, of an efficient neighborhood, is reflected in the Siemensstraße Housing Estate as well. So, as said, in his early days, Schuster was quite enthusiastic for the communist and socialist ideology, but then he more and more moved to the political right, and in the 1930s, he worked for the Austrian Fascist Party and finally even for the National Socialists. And I guess this is the main reason why Schuster is nearly forgotten nowadays. The historians simply didn't want to get in touch with this problematic and a bit dubious person, and didn't want to get in touch with his architectural legacy. But now, 50 years after his death, the time has come to look at his work in a new light. And that's exactly what we wanted to do when we started to focus on the Siemensstraße. And it quickly turned out that despite Schuster's permanent ideological leaps and reorientations, he obviously was very consequent in going his own way. And even more, it turned out that the Siemensstraße estate can and must be seen as the result of all the ideas he had developed in earlier days. One of the most impressive and formative chapters in his life was the period when he worked in Hellerau near Dresden. Near Dresden, in Germany, eastern parts of Germany, in Saxony, from 1919 to 1923. As you probably know, Hellerau is a splendid example for the so-called Garden City movement. This was a method of urban planning in which self-contained communities are surrounded by green belts. Its aim was to capture the primary benefits of a countryside environment and a city environment while avoiding the disadvantages presented by both. Based on the idea of social reform, the whole discourse on the Garden City movement was about living a healthy life under nonetheless modern urban circumstances. And that's why these garden cities generally were erected at the periphery of the cities. In other words, the garden city concept combined the town and the country in order to provide an alternative to working and living on farms or in crowded, unhealthy cities. And that's exactly what we can observe in Hellerau. Walking through the streets, the whole city undeniably had a more or less rural character, as if you live in a village. There are streets with curved rows of houses, and in front of each house there was a little garden where the people, the residents, could sit in the sun or plant their own fruits and vegetables. But, and that's the crucial aspect of this concept, in the very vicinity, very close to the houses, there was, for instance, a monumental theater named Bildungsanstalt in those days, or a kind of center for learning and education. In any case, it was a venue for music and dance performances. So as a result, in Hellerau, we have a fascinating combination of nature and culture, of rural and urban life, planned and erected by some of the leading and most prominent architects in Central Europe. Franz Schuster lived there for 4 years. He worked there as an assistant of one of these famous architects, Heinrich Dessenow, and what Schuster experienced in Dresden, what he learned there, finally turned out to be the guiding principles for him as an architect. It was exactly what he wanted to achieve with his own work, After 4 years, he left Dresden and came back to Vienna in 1923. He was assigned to erect the so-called Wasserturm estate in the very south of Vienna, and the character of this estate is quite similar to what Schuster had seen in Hellerau. Again, we can find a strong emphasis on the nature in general, on the green space all around, and again the houses are not very high. It's a 2-story housing estate with optimized room layouts and simply decorated facades. The sober and modest character of the Wasserturm estate is worth being noted because at the same time, in the mid-20s, many other architects started to build skyscrapers, for instance, or huge, massive residential blocks. Just to give one example, between 1924 and 1926, one of Schuster's colleagues was engaged to erect the so-called Lassalhof in the 2nd district of Vienna. This building had a monumental presence on the street with an 8-story tower with 2 floors of artist studios at the top, and we had once we had the chance to get up there, and it is a marvelous outlook all over the city. So you see, compared to Schuster and his intention to gain a kind of symbiosis between nature and modern architecture, Gessner had a very different idea of modern living and the needs of an urban population. In 1927, Schuster was invited to go back to Germany and to join the staff of Ernst May, who was the mastermind of the so-called New Frankfurt, das Neue Frankfurt. Here the cover of one of the journals they published there. For Schuster, this indeed was a decisive step in his career, because now he worked as in one of the centers of European modernity. The New Frankfurt stood for the most progressive and most powerful ideas of urban planning. Ernst May, the chief architect in Frankfurt, reflected on contemporary housing in a very innovative way, and he did that on a global scale. May not only worked in Germany, but also in Poland, in Russia, and even in East and South Africa. Franz Schuster learned quite a lot there in Frankfurt, especially about the importance of green space planning. Here I show you 2 examples, 2 pictures from the New Frankfurt. And the Siedlung Römerstadt is the estate, is the Siedlung which was planned by May and realized then by Franz Schuster. And even more important for him, for his own development, Schuster there in Frankfurt was confronted with a long-lasting political discussion on the size of the units. Since in 1928 in Frankfurt there were nearly 20,000 people looking for an apartment, the politicians and the architects realized the urgency to build as fast as possible. Following May, it is better to have a small flat than to have no flat at all. You can see this Problem lautet heute, I translated, the problem today is not a small apartment or big apartment as it was in the 19th century, but no apartment or small apartment. I'm just mentioning this because 20 years later, after World War II, we can find exactly the same discussion going on, but this time in Vienna, and the man who stood in the center of these discussions was Franz Schuster, who could rely on the experiences he had made in interwar Frankfurt. The other important aspect of Schuster's activities in Germany is about his growing interest in questions of furnishing. As a professor at the Frankfurt School of Applied Arts, at the Städelschule, he started to focus on the appropriate design of kitchens and of living rooms in small and tiny flats. This, of course, was an interesting subject and a real challenge, because it is evident the smaller your flat is, the fewer rooms you have, the more you are forced to economically organize your life. Wohnen lernen, learning to live, was one of the key words in those days, not only in Frankfurt, but in Vienna as well. Schuster published various books on the subjects, and this again was relevant for his further intellectual development, because later on in the 1950s, at the Siemensstraße Housing Estate, he faced the problem of furnishing in small flats again. During the dark years of Austro-fascism and National Socialism, we find Schuster being back in Vienna again. As a professor at the Vienna School of Applied Arts, he educated more than 100 young artists, with many women among them. And then finally, after the end of World War II, when large parts of Vienna were destroyed, just watch it, this, were destroyed and had to be rebuilt, Schuster immediately was engaged to help, because the situation was absolutely dramatic. They produced a poster in those days where you can see that during the interwar years in Vienna, there had been 64,000 flats being erected, but during the war, 86,000 flats were damaged. So this is it for the moment from my side. Now I handle over again to Wolfgang.
Yeah, this brings us to the situation of post-Second World War Vienna. We can see here 86,000 homes were destroyed or deemed uninhabitable. So this meant that more than 12% of homes could not be used anymore, which left around 270,000 people homeless or being forced to live in ruins. Floridsdorf, the 21st district of Vienna, north of the river Danube, with many industrial facilities that often existed since the 19th century and therefore with a strong working class tradition, was particularly affected, especially by aircraft attacks. So around 10,000 houses in the 21st district, more than 3,000 were destroyed or heavily damaged. Right after the war, Vienna's inhabitants could only survive through international help, mainly provided by the Allied forces, the Soviet Union, the USA, Great Britain, and France, as well as from European countries, especially Switzerland and Sweden. The city administration was, after the collapse of the Third Reich, again social democratic, and immediately established a building program that only slowly gained momentum, since the fact that other than after the First War, Vienna had been a battleground, and you saw the pictures, was heavily damaged. So therefore, this rapid building program was launched by the end of the 1940s, resulting in 4,000 newly built homes by 1954. As Georg already mentioned, Franz Schuster was one of the driving forces behind the program. The responsible political person was City Councillor Franz Jonas, who later became Vienna's mayor and in 1965 president of Austria. But as Georg has already mentioned, Schuster had to stay behind the scenes most of the time because of his involvement in international socialism. Nevertheless, he became the leading architect during this period of reconstruction in the 1940s and 50s. And 1950 marked the beginning of the realization of Schuster's main project within this rapid building program, the Siemensstraße Housing Estate, with more than 1,700 accommodation units. So this project ranks among the pioneering achievements of the era of reconstruction and attracted international attention. For example, it was presented as an example of high quality and affordable housing at an exhibition in New Delhi, India. But Schuster's concept, as you have already heard, was deeply rooted in the ideas of Red Vienna's and interwar architecture. His new concept he called New Neighborhood, that followed English and Swedish concepts of urban development and meant a new form of metropolitan existence or coexistence. The utopian and ideological idea of Red Vienna's architecture gearing towards this socialistic new human was not relevant anymore. And on top of it, the National Socialists' concept of a racial collective that had led directly into Holocaust and the global war had poisoned any forms of community in the German-speaking world. So the concept of new neighborhood was an idea to step into the breach, considering the needs of different groups of a post-war society, such as single persons, families with children, elderly, and most of them heavily traumatized. And yeah, so in other words, Schuster's concept, although building on the visions of the time before the war, had to be much more pragmatic. Since contemporary society was overaged, many soldiers who had survived were still prisoners of war. There was a huge number of invalids, orphans, and widows, and so on. So the new neighborhood also had to organize the coexistence of victims and offenders of National Socialism, and at the same time reshape the spaces of post-war Vienna. The Siemensstraße estate was integrated into the still existing established architecture, opening up green spaces and brownfield land and destroyed areas, and created a connection to the surrounding industrial areas, where reconstruction already had been started, mainly under the guidance of the Soviet Union, and where the next phase was on the rise, the so-called economic miracle, also called the Miracle on the Rhine, which was a period of rapid reconstruction and economic development triggered by the USA's Marshall Plan. So I think now it's time to get to the estate itself.
Yeah, thank you. And as Wolfgang just said, the Siemensstraße estate was integrated into the existing architecture. You can see that by taking the bird's eye view. In the foreground of this photograph, we see the older houses from the late 19th century. And on the left side, there are houses from the early 1920s. When you will visit the exhibition next week, I would recommend you to take a little walk through the area to see these older houses there. So it gets clear in any case. It gets clear that Schuster obviously wanted to expand the existing urban structure. In other words, it was his intention. It was not his intention to simply put the new estate into the green belt of Floridsdorf, but rather to bring the different styles from different times together, to infuse them in order to create an organic architectural unit. This was one of the main the keywords in his writings, in Schuster's writings. He again and again organized the necessity, emphasized the necessity of an organisches Wachstum, of organic growth. The Siemensstraße estate is of enormous size. The distance the distance from the west to the east, from one side to another, is about 1 kilometer. And when we take a closer look at the photograph, we see what Wolfgang just had mentioned. There are big free space, green space, big gardens between the houses. Perhaps to give some details on the estate, here the plan, the map of it. You see we have a total area of about 174,000 square meters. But the built area is only covering about 36,000 square meters, which isn't more than 21%. All the rest is free space, is nature, gardens, trees, bushes, lawns, and so on and so forth. And that's the reason why sometimes when you visit the estate, you have this surprising impression of not being in Vienna, not being in a city, in a capital, but rather in a small village somewhere in the countryside. But coming back to the map, looking again on this map of the area, we see the intended infrastructure of the estate. So when you look, for instance, at number 1 here, this is the so-called Volksheim, which can be translated with communication center. Schuster didn't erect a theater, as it was the case in Hellerau, but that this very Volksheim, this communication center, where the residents could organize parties, here's a photograph of organized parties, where music played, where bands performed, where films were shown, and so on. It was a communication center for the neighborhood. The political idea behind that was to offer the people the opportunity to have a social life. In a book published in 1954 on the architecture of Vienna, we find the following passage about the Siemensstraße. You can read it. But not only tenement houses are being erected in Vienna within the compass of the social city building program. That's an interesting terminology. It was not just a building program, a city building program, but it was a social city program. So the importance of this social factor was emphasized. So also all those social institutions are not forgotten, which a modern city requires in order to bring forth a healthy, organically harmonious and emotionally balanced new generation: schools, kindergartens, parks, playgrounds, etc., etc. Franz Schuster was very aware of that kind of infrastructure, because back in 1926 he already had planned such a Volksheim, or a Volksbildungsheim as it was named in those days. Again, we have the plan with a stage here. Hold on, there's the Bühnenraum. This was the stage. Interesting, we have here a Lehrzimmer, it's a kind of room for educating, and another one. And on the other side, we have a Bibliothek and Lesezimmer. So a teaching room, a reading room, a library, and so on. What we learned from that, it was not just about, the whole idea was not just about entertainment, theater, music, and so on, but also about education and self-education. And that's exactly what was reflected in the 50s in the Siemensstraße estate as well. But this was not the only infrastructural innovation at the Siemensstraße. Another one, when you look back, another one is the big kindergarten being located. The kindergarten is here, being number 2, being located in the midst of the estate, which underlines the importance of the younger generation. It's more or less a symbol for a better future. And it's striking to see that Schuster used really big windows in order to make the rooms sunny and bright and healthy. And finally, in the eastern part of the estate, Schuster planned the so-called Heimstätte für alte Menschen, a residential home for the elderly, where the elder generation, the grandfathers and grandmothers, could live their own life. So I'm coming now to the end. However, probably the most interesting aspect of the Siemensstraße is the so-called Duplex System, and I guess you have already heard about it. And next week, when you visit the exhibition, you will have the chance to discuss it again. And here again, I would like to quote from this just mentioned book, this catalog, and because the duplex system is explained there quite well. This program was begun in the past few years in order to reduce the acute housing shortage as quickly as possible. By being able to produce double the number of flats as could be done under the normal building program, it was possible to help especially such families as require only a small flat, for instance, newly married couples and old people. The idea underlying the system is that a large flat, especially an evolved type, is contemporarily divided into two small flats, which are let to two independent tenants. After the worst housing shortage has been alleviated, which stage will be reached in Vienna in a few years, each pair of flats can be united into one bigger flat at very small cost. The displaced family will then be given a suitable flat constructed under the normal building program, work on which is, of course, being carried on all the time. This sounds a bit complicated, but actually it's not. I show you here the system again. What we see here is on the left the flat, such a duplex flat, duplex unit prior to the unification. So you go in there. You have the entrance. Then you have here this wohnzimmer, the living room, and the sleeping room, in between a very small, very tiny kitchen. And here the toilet. Next to it, here's the toilet. And it's striking to realize that in the Siemensstraße there was no bath. But then, after the unification, these two flats were united, and so the idea was simply to break down here this wall and to close this entrance. So you have this one entrance. It's quite hard. I have to change over there one moment. So so you made out of this flat, a small flat, a more small unit, you have a bigger one, one entrance, and again the sleeping room, the kitchen there, and now you have another sleeping room and another sleeping room. And the interesting aspect now is that instead of the second kitchen, now the architect planned to put in, where is the mouse? Hold on. Anyway, number 5. When you look at number 5, so instead of the second bath and the second kitchen, now you have a bathroom. So this is in the end, this is the principle of the duplex system. But next week at the exhibition, you will see a model. One of your colleagues from the Technical University in Vienna has supported us, and they made a model of this duplex system. So we will have the chance to discuss it again. So I will give back to the word to Wolfgang.
Yeah. So let me just quickly tell you a little bit more about about the exhibition that came into being in cooperation with contemporary witnesses whose memories communicated with the research we did and provided valuable sources. These witnesses were born between 1942 and 1951, grew up in the Siemensstraße complex, and many of them still live there. There is a city-funded institution in Vienna, the Wohnpartner team, who is focusing on social and cultural work in all of Vienna's municipal buildings, and they provided this group of now elderly people a space to reflect and communicate their memories, which led into an oral history project that became the starting initiative of the exhibition itself. So here you can see on our book presentation we had a few weeks ago some of these witnesses. We did numerous interviews with them, and these interviews became also the base of our book about the Siemensstraße that Georg and I published together with Werner, Michael Schwarz, and Susanne Winkler. So let me give you a very quick summary of the memories and the reflection of these inhabitants. Growing up in the Siemensstraße complex meant to have to learn to deal with constricted rooms. Families had to find spatial solutions for storage, for the organization of everyday life. So as Georg already mentioned, Franz Schuster did also interior design. He did that after Second World War II, and he offered a collection of furniture that was aiming for good quality, modernity, and affordability. But it turned out that this collection, which nowadays became kind of iconic for 1950s interior design, was still too expensive for most of the people, and most importantly, it was not functional enough for families living on around 30 square meters. Often compact built-in closets, cupboards, folding beds, folding tables, and small fitted kitchens were built by local carpenters and by residents themselves. Folding tables were used multifunctionally. They became workspace, desks for the school kids' homework, and provided even space to play for the children. Since the new units had no warm water, small flow-type heaters were installed on the residents' own initiative. The public bath of the complex, which was an idea of Red Vienna 2, was very small in dimension, with less than 20 shower units for more than 1,700 living units. So the residents had to become creative once again. Folding shower trays were installed in the kitchen, close to the water connection. Small mobile bathtubs for children had to be placed on top of the toilet for an uncomplicated water drain. And this constricted room situation forced the kids to get outside. During summer times, the kids' pool that Schuster had planned too became an important place, as well as the ample green spaces of the housing complex. But very soon it was forbidden to step on the lawns of these yards. So the kids started to explore the brownfields that still existed around the complex and found their space to play, to build own soccer fields in summer and ice skating rinks in winter. And in winter, there was a tennis field right in the neighborhood of the complex, and this was used in winter as an official ice skating rink, which became, like the kids' pool in summer, in winter, a very important social space. In the public education venue, the Volksheim that Georg showed, movies were shown and provided first cinematic experiences of international, mostly Hollywood and Walt Disney films. Most of the kids also took part in the activities of the Social Democrats youth organizations, like the Red Falcons, which is a Boy Scout version of the party. And these organizations had their venues inside in this complex too. So growing up, many of the contemporary witnesses found employment in the industry nearby. The ways to the workplaces were short, mostly accessible by foot or by bicycle. Groceries, small handicraft businesses within the complex, also planned by Schuster, provided a good supply of everyday goods, as well as personal contact, and were also easily accessible by foot. So all of these elderly people considered that much better than today's system of supermarkets and shopping centers. Reflecting their childhood, nearly all of the contemporary witnesses came to the conclusion that the spatial restrictions they had to deal with were demanding, but the answers they had to find to this problem resulted, as they all said, in a happy childhood, a good experience of community, and long-lasting friendships. Many of them stayed in the Siemensstraße after marriage and lived there with their own new families. So it seems that Franz Schuster's concept of the new neighborhood turned out to be most effective outside of the units. Yeah, I think, Georg, if you want to add something, if not, we could start discussion.
Yeah, no, I think the floor is open for any discussion. You're welcome to ask some questions. Thank you for your patience and for the audience.
Thank you. So I guess that's all rooted in this idea of the duplex system. So as Georg showed this definition of the duplex system, it really was, the idea was to build many small units for the severe shortage. And afterwards, I think Schuster was thinking in terms of 10 years or something like that. Those units should have been combined. In fact, in reality, it turned out that that didn't happen because of the very simple fact that the units, it was never the case that one unit was free and the other one was the one that the family living in the other one could get the other room. So that didn't work. It started working in the 60s, mainly in the 1990s, and when the whole complex was refurbished in 2004, many of these duplex units were brought together. So the idea of the public outside space is of course rooted in the ideas of Red Vienna architecture, and I think it was also part of the new neighborhood concept of Schuster that was really focusing on social life. Yeah, I hope that was an answer.
Yeah. Well, the second question to Nadana, was the complex maintenance fully provided by the city of Vienna? Yes, the answer is yes. This is one of the interesting aspects of the whole housing policy in Vienna. They really invest lots of money to do that. This is one of the answers why the quality of these houses is still enormous, and that's why the people do not want to leave. Many of them, at least, do not want to leave. And yes, it was fully provided by the municipality, so by Vienna as a city. Well, yeah, that's a good question, because you're right. It seems so at first sight. It seems so, but we have to consider the situation after the World War. The city really was damaged. It was extremely damaged, and therefore they simply didn't have enough money to install the baths. So it can be seen as a step back, but on the other side, it must be explained as the result of the actual circumstances. And as Wolfgang has mentioned, they were erecting a so-called Tröpfelbad, a public bath where the people could go there to take a shower, to take a bath. But anyway, this caused serious discussions about hygiene questions and about the necessity to have a bath. And only 1 year later, so they started to erect the Siemensstraße estate in 1950, and then they had these discussions, and only 1 year later, in 1951, the city of Vienna decided that from now on, any public building, any public estate has to be there has to be baths as well. This was obligatory then. So it's interesting that the Siemensstraße, the Siemensstraße estate indeed was the last public estate without bars. Only 1 year later, the situation changed.
Yeah, and just going back to the duplex system, this step back from the achievements of Red Vienna was planned to be solved by the duplex system. So afterwards, there would have been bathrooms in every unit. Yes, in 2004, there was a huge refurbishing of the whole complex. And there was, so now from outside, there was thermal refurbishing. Heating is an interesting topic. At the beginning, in the 50s, the units had coal ovens. And this was also, as the witnesses told us, solved by own initiative. So during the 60s, many inhabitants started to get these ovens out and find other solutions. Unfortunately, I don't know the English word for Außenkonvektoren. But from then on, the coal ovens were driven out, and in the meantime, there is a central heating system, of course.
Now it's long distance heating. Yeah. Is the area, and they try to bring this system in each flats now.
Yeah, in most of them, not in all of them, as far as we know. But perhaps Nariman, you know this better. Yes, as far as we know, yes, they are occupied. And that's an interesting aspect because up till a few years ago, the Siemensstraße was not so well, as said, not well known, but it was about mainly the older generation who lived there, and the younger ones didn't. But now the situation is changing. So some 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were there again, and there we had a long and fruitful discussion, communication with a young couple about 25 years or so, and they moved there, and they were absolutely happy to live there. Most of all because it's absolutely calm there. It is as sad as if you live in the countryside. You do not hear any traffic. It's all you hear is the birds singing. Yeah, it's a kind of strange but really wonderful quality of living, and I guess this is the reason why more and more younger people tend to go to Floridsdorf. Although I said it's quite far away from the center. It takes a half an hour or so with the metro to go, with the buses and the tramway to go to the city. But on the other side you have this high quality of living.
And it's very interesting that especially this young couple we talked to, they said that they moved into the apartment of their grandmother. Mm-hmm. So it was like I think it was the guy whose grandmother lived there, and he said he knew this apartment from childhood days, and he knew the stories of his grandmother. So it was very attractive for both of them to move in because they had a good opinion about it. Since the whole complex is very big, it's hard to get data for that from the social institutions of Vienna. There are different areas, or the apartments are used for different kind of people. So you have still the older generation living there. You have young families, many families with migrant background, and there are certain parts. But that's exactly where you don't really get data for really social projects. For example, there are some apartments reserved for former homeless people who start to get into living into an apartment again, and there are special programs from the city of Vienna for that. So there is a quite diverse population in the settlement in the meantime.
Yeah, they are protected by the state, the so-called Denkmalschutz, the protecting. So you cannot destroy it, you cannot change it. It is protected by the state in this sense. There is a list. You probably know that better than we do, but there is a list, and in this list, any building all around Austria, any building which is which is on this list is protected, and you cannot. No one is allowed to change it. It is the goal to conserve the ensemble in this sense, to conserve the historic material, and insofar the Siemensstraße estate will survive.
Okay. Well, I'm very interested to Siemensstraße that if the building block has been conserved, to be conserved, then what kind of quote unquote the flexibility to change? Because if we are not changed, sometimes we cannot utilize for our purpose today or in the future. So what do you think about the priority to change because of the coming future utilization of this housing? Do you have any recommendation or suggestion? For example, the bathroom should be more standardized, or kitchens or the light sunshine should be coming into the rooms, because this is a housing standard. If they are not compliant with this standard today.
I'm not quite sure if I fully understood the question, because I have some problems with the acoustics. Could you repeat the question once again?
Okay.
Excuse me.
Usually the conservations of heritage of the building complex have the purpose also for using for today's or contemporary or future use. So sometimes if you don't change your buildings, then it's not suitable for our purpose today's living.
Mm-hmm.
So then what kind of thing that is not compliant with today's standard of living
Mm-hmm.
of this Siemensstraße? Is that clear for you?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a basic problem of conservation theories at all. But in any case, there is something. So the solution is somewhere in between. It's clear, as it turned out, that there was no bath in it, but the baths are standard in all around the world, and it's a necessity to do that. So of course they changed their mood. And of course, they said, "Yeah, we have to do that, despite the conservation, the conservation theory." In this case, it was not so. As concerning the Siemensstraße, it was not so problematic, because the estate only came, only was declared as being protected in, I think, in 2005 or so, only 15 years ago, and. But still, the question is absolutely relevant, And if now, for instance, it turns out that that Vienna is getting hotter and hotter, and then they have to react on that. Then they have to, I don't know, to plant new trees or to use more water and so on and so forth. Then they will do that definitely. And that's the positive aspect, that it is the city of Vienna who is in charge of that. Yes, okay. It is true. It's very true that there is this restrictions of conservation, but nevertheless we have to think of the inhabitants there, and insofar it's more important to support them, to help them.
Yeah, it was for us. It was a very interesting experience when we made guided tours through the complex with people from the city, like urban development people and architects. And it was very interesting that, apart from the units itself, but when you look at the complex itself, many of these people said it's so interesting that so many questions that we have to deal today are already in a way answered in this concept. So, for example, talking about climate change, there is much more green space than in other municipal buildings. So that's already kind of a step into the right direction. When you think about ideas of intergenerational living, this idea of the home of the elderly, which is not functioning anymore because it's way too small for the dimension, but the idea behind it. So people were always very surprised that Schuster already in the 1950s had found answers to questions we face today. Other questions like automobility were not considered at the time, which actually led into a really bad parking space situation. But in the meantime, that seems not to be a problem anymore too. And there are like concepts from the city like short-term parking and stuff like that. But it's interesting that many questions of today were already considered by Franz Schuster.
Okay. Yeah, looking at for the landscape itself is quite nice, and I think I agree with you that was one of the the component that we cannot change because we need that one. But say like Marcus have been giving us lecture 2 weeks ago, yeah, that's
yes,
showing us
approximately
the brownfield of development of the brownfield of the gasometer, which is quite nice buildings. But then I looking at the not the Jarnovel development of the inner of the tank, but the Kophammer Blue, the Wolf Bricks dormitory that attached to the old building with quite strange things, quite form-based speaking a strange thing, but that was the good functions to make this gasometer. But my question is that if we put it some like infill design or attach new things, which is possible on that complex. Of course, we have argument on the function, of course, but the form, the new structure, the new function that support this housing more well, good or better. Is it possible with the new form or something like that?
If I understood it right, it's not possible to, for example, add another store because the complex is protected. Okay. It's very interesting, and we didn't find details of that. But Georg, maybe you want to say more about this discussion in the 1990s when the city of Vienna had exactly this idea, and they presented it to very famous and architects and architectural theorists like Friedrich Achleitner. And what these people said was completely the opposite. They said you have to be aware of the historic relevance of this complex, and that's why it has to be preserved the way it is. So all these ideas of more density and putting up more stores were rejected. But that was actually the first idea of the city of Vienna.
Thank you very much.